built on relationships, focused on people, and rooted in the community. Welcome to the Build Blue podcast. Tune in for weekly episodes featuring guests who are building a better tomorrow. You'll hear inspiring stories from industry leaders, business owners, community partners, and our team members. The Build Blue podcast, where construction comes to life. An Apex Construction Group production. Welcome to the Build Blue podcast. My name is Jess Blaze, and we are joined on today's episode by Nancy Zallek of the Mankato Area Foundation. And we're going to start, Nancy, first by welcoming you, and thank you for coming on. We would like for you to tell us a little bit about your role at the Mankato Area Foundation, and then we'll dive deeper into the foundation's work in a little bit.
Sure. My title is President and CEO of the Mankato Area Foundation, which it sounds fancier than it really is. What my job is, if I just break it down to the most simplistic terms, is I help people give their money away. You know, we have an incredibly generous community that is very philanthropic, and often they want to give back to this community and they're not really sure how or in what manner. And so we connect the dots between the people who need the use of their charitable dollars and the people who are so generous and want to give them.
Which sounds like a dream job.
It is. I'm not denying it. Great. It is really fun.
We start all of our Apex podcasts with our Apex Icebreaker, and it's the same for everyone. And it's always so interesting to hear people's answer to this question because the range has been huge. So if you could open and run any business, what would it be?
You're going to accuse me of giving the party line or something, but honestly, it is what I'm doing currently. I would have told you 30 years ago that it would be running a retail store because that was my previous life and I loved it. But I got this opportunity at the Mankato Area Foundation, and I just can't honestly imagine doing something else. It is that much fun.
Which is awesome. And so to piggyback off of that question, since you and your family did own the local Brett's department store for over 125 years, is that correct? Let's talk about your family's history in Mankato. You are sixth generation Mankato?
Fifth generation. Our kids are sixth generation. Yes, my great-great-grandfather, Georgie Brett, it was our last name at the time, came to this area, and rumor has it he had a very good friend whose last name was Dayton, and the two of them, one went up to Minneapolis and one stayed here, and we know the rest of that story.
Yes.
But I do not regret that he chose to build a department store in this region because this is where my family has lived for the last 120 some years, and it's been just wonderful place to live and raise a family, and I'm very grateful to their foresight to reside here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have, if you're watching on YouTube, where we're sitting, we have a great view of what was the Brett's department store.
Correct. We actually had by the time we closed, we had a number of branches. We actually had 7 or 8 Brett's stores and another 11 Ehlers stores. We owned another specialty store chain at the time. But this was our home base. This was our flagship store that, if you could see, it was called the Empire Store when it first started. And I have pictures of the horse and buggy going past on a dirt road with the Empire Store. And it was, it was piece goods at the time. They didn't sell ready to wear. They sold, fabric. And it's just amazing to see what it started as and then what it became and then what it morphed into, which is no longer a family-owned department store, which makes sense for the times that we're in.
It does. And I love with our office downtown, all of these historic buildings and just imagining if the walls of these buildings could talk.
I know.
And the stories that they could tell and the people that they've seen. I think that's one really cool thing about Mankato is the history and these old buildings that are still here.
Well, and this was, the Grafe building. It had a retail store here too. One of the Grafe girls was a good friend of mine, and so we hung out and did retail together. Yeah. So there's a lot of old memories in these buildings.
Very cool. Let's talk about your professional background.
Well, as we were just talking about, it has not exactly been linear. I grew up working in our department store, and I loved it. I saw myself as being one of the leaders of that organization along with my older brother. And but in the 90s, times were changing, and family-owned department stores were dropping like flies. And we saw the fact that, the writing was on the wall. It wasn't going to exist much longer. So as a family, we had to make the decision to close the store, which was tough because back then people worked for us for decades. Mm-hmm. And my kids think everybody worked at Brett's department store because everybody's always stopping them and saying, I used to work there. And, but they, again, I don't mean to sound trite, but they were family. Mm-hmm. And so we probably held on a little longer than maybe we should have, just because we just couldn't imagine closing it and ending that era. But it became evident that we needed to. And so then it was, what am I if I'm not running a department store and picking out cute clothes? And so I decided to stay home for a little bit. And I was 8.5 months. It was an easy decision because I was 8.5 months pregnant with our second child when the store closed. And so it just made sense. And I wound up having a third child. And when he got in kindergarten, I decided time to look for something else. And briefly, my daughter was in ballet at the time, and in a Mankato ballet company that that always been volunteer run, had never had an executive director, and I was approached to be their first executive director. I had danced all the way through college, so it was something that I loved. I knew what it could do for self-esteem and for young girls and boys, and so I took on that challenge. And we were able to really have a successful run we grew the ballet company significantly at the time, and now it's even larger and doing even better.
Beautiful new location.
Yep, it's just great. But it was my training ground for the nonprofit world. I took that job and really literally learned on the job. I attended a board meeting and went, oh, this is bylaws. I didn't know what they were, so there was a lot of learning, but it was a great place to start. I started part-time, and then from there went to the United Way. And after the United Way, a position came up with the Mankato Area Foundation, and I just loved the mission. I loved the idea of capturing the generosity of this community and trying to find a way to align it with the needs mm-hmm. and the opportunities in the community. And that's where I've been ever since 2009. So 13 years I've been with the foundation.
It's hard to believe that 2009 was 13 years ago.
I know. That's what I think too.
Whoa. So obviously your career started in retail and then switched over to the nonprofit when your kids were school aged. But did you have an early interest in philanthropic giving, a nonprofit world?
Well, if you were raised in my family, that was just one and the same. I mean, my parents were incredibly active on boards and civically active, but they also were very, very philanthropic. They believed in giving back to the community that had been good to them. They led with that always. And I just thought that's what everybody did, and that was just because I was fortunate enough to be brought up in a family with just some really solid concepts about how you support your community. And so that's how I learned it. And in fact, the full disclosure, when the foundation started in 1974 as a volunteer-run organization, it was volunteer-run for almost 30 years. My mother was the first board chair. So I grew up hearing about the Mankato Area Foundation and, the projects they were working on. I didn't really understand at the time what they were doing, but learned over time. And so, it was just an amazing full circle to then be employed by the same foundation that she helped start.
Absolutely. Those serendipitous moments are so special.
It is. It really is.
So cool. I'm sure that many, if not all of our listeners are familiar with the Mankato Area Foundation, but for someone who may not fully understand the scope of the work, can you explain in a little more detail
more than just helping people give their money away?
Which is wonderful.
So we work very closely, with the nonprofit community, so that we understand the needs and challenges in the community. They're on the front line trying to really help lift the community up. But they can't do that without financial support. And so then we also work very closely with individuals and families and corporations who want to give back. And we help do that by helping them set up funds. You might think of back in the day, people had family foundations, and they still do, but now it takes a much larger amount of money to make it make sense for everything that you have to do to have a family foundation. So we kind of provide that opportunity for individuals and for families that can, by establishing a fund, it's like having their own mini foundation underneath our umbrella. So they make a contribution to the foundation. They get a tax deduction for that contribution. They set up that fund, and then we start working with them to find out what does that look like for them? What does it mean to be philanthropic? And one of the things I say is that if you've met one donor, you've met one donor, because they are all so different in how they want to give back in the areas that they want to give back in. And some people want to do it when they're alive. Some people want to leave a bequest and a legacy for after when they die. Some people want to give to education and food insecurities and housing insecurity, and others might want to set up a scholarship. And that's the fun piece, is that we sit down with each one of those donors and really try to figure out what buttons can really get them excited about giving back, because we know secret that if they have fun giving money away, they want to give more money away. And so truly, people get really excited when they can actually see the difference it makes. And so we have that ability to understand this region and to connect those donors with the nonprofits so they can really see the difference that their philanthropy makes in this community. And then again, it makes them want to do it some more.
And what's cool is the personalized approach.
That is, our foundation is a little bit different that way. A lot of the foundations that started back in the 20s and 30s, people just gave money to the foundation and said, here, we trust you to do what's best with the money, go for it. Starting in about the 80s or 90s, it became much more personal. People really wanted to know what they were giving to. And so we really focused on, after I started, in building the foundation, we focused on what we call donor advised funds. And that's the product I talk about when I talk about kind of almost like having their own family foundation. Because with a donor advised fund, it is incredibly personal. And so that allows us to, again, really understand how they want to impact this community and then find that resource that works for them.
So with the legacy giving, I imagine that there's some interesting involvement with families, and when they get to actually see that come to fruition, I imagine that's pretty special too.
There's that's another thing about this community, is that people give money away while they're alive, but numerous individuals in this community have aligned with the foundation to make sure that they will continue to take care of this community when they're no longer here. And again, that's a really interesting conversation to have. What does that look like? Because you don't know if that's 10 years, 20 years. Is this into perpetuity? So what does your giving look like today, and what might it look like 50 years from now, and what will the needs of the community be 50 years from now? So you have to be pretty clever in how you word some of this for the future staff of the foundation that is going to actually be the ones to manage the fund. But it's fun, and it can be multi-generational. The other thing that can happen is that donors can establish a fund, but then put family members or friends to be an advisor to it that we can continue to work with, because nobody knows their charitable desires probably better than their family. And so it's fun to be able to work multi-generationally with families.
Absolutely. And what about businesses, corporations, things like that? How do they work into the foundation?
So again, this community, I keep saying this over and over again, but I have the advantage of going out and meeting with a lot of other community foundations across the state. And when I talk about Mankato, they almost always say, what is in the water there? We don't get it, because we decide that we want to build a children's museum, we build a children's museum. If we want to create shared spaces, which is a center for nonprofits, we do that. We have a senior center in Vine. Anything that I shouldn't say anything, but many of the things that we identify as critical to this community, our community steps up and helps make happen. And that happens not only in personal contributions, but a great deal of many corporate contributions. And so one of the things that we have done is to create what we call kind of a corporate donor advised fund, where we can work with companies to, again, do that same thing. They are hit up daily for support for a variety of projects and programs in the community. But we'll work with the company and often their employees to say, what kind of impact do you really want to make? In what area? And really help educate them about the needs of the community so that we can work with their teams and really make their charitable giving impactful as well. And the feedback we get is that it also has increased their giving as well. So instead of just writing a check every time somebody asks, not that that's a bad thing, but it's a little bit more thoughtful and a little bit more planned. And I think they feel sometimes better about it. And we know that we are connecting them to the areas that make a difference to them. So we do the same thing for businesses that we do for individuals. And that's I want to say recent. It's been in the last several years that's really grown. Mm-hmm. We started out with individuals and families, and now we've spread to the business world, and that's going really well.
It sounds like a nice way for giving to become more intentional.
That's exactly the wording. It rather than, like I said, just kind of squeaky wheel, I don't know what else to do. Where that doesn't feel good necessarily. And at the end of the year, if they can't identify what they donated to or what kind of difference they made, my tendency is to think that those charitable budgets maybe get cut. But when they can look at the end of the year and say, look at the difference we made, then it's our belief and actually our knowledge that their charitable giving goes up. And so ultimately that's our goal, is to make philanthropy rewarding and tangible for them so that the giving will continue and will increase over time.
Absolutely. So say I'm Joe donor or Joe business owner, and I would like to get involved. What does that kind of look like, that process of setting up an appointment, kind of figuring out what the donation is, and can you walk us through what that looks like?
I can. And one of the things that we do as a foundation is we work very closely with what we call trusted advisors. So attorneys, CPAs, wealth managers, investment managers, because often they are on the front line. They are, they're meeting with their clients regularly, and they understand if somebody wants to be charitable. Maybe they've had a life event, they've sold a business or something, and they need to be charitable. Mm-hmm. It will be beneficial to them. So often our first call doesn't have to be by any means, but often our first call is maybe from that advisor saying, I'm working with this family, and this is their situation, and they would like to be charitable, and I think a donor advised fund is what would make sense for them. And so we sit down either with the advisor and the family, or just individually with the family, and kind of lay out what all of their options are. That said, if somebody is listening to this and thinks this makes sense for them, picking up the phone and just calling the foundation and talking to Maureen Gustafson or me, we will do the same thing. So we'll sit down and we'll talk about all your options. And then frequently we say, and now this would be a good time to go back and talk with your CPA. Sure. Because charitable giving needs to be planned too. You want to make sure that it is not only beneficial to the community and to the nonprofit sector that you're supporting, but makes the most sense for your own personal situation. And sometimes you can just do it in ways that are more beneficial than others. And so we often say, let's sit down with, again, your CPA or your investment manager, and make sure that the timing is right, that this makes sense for you this year. Should we spread it out over a few years? So we use a multitude of resources to make sure that that the planned charitable giving is intentional and makes sense for the individuals or families at the time.
Absolutely. Sometimes I think there's a misconception, and this goes for any kind of charitable giving, that you have to have a lot of money in order to get involved. Can you speak to that and maybe let our listeners know different ways that they can get involved if they don't have a large amount of money right now?
And thank you for asking that question, because that is probably one of the misnomers that I like to disparage. So I'm going to be real honest. When I started, foundations generally had minimums. They're like, to start a fund, it needs to be this big. And because there's a certain amount of work that goes into it, and so that was kind of the business standard at the time. But early on, we looked at it and went, if our goal is to increase philanthropy in the community and increase, charitable giving, we don't want people to wait. You don't want people to sit there and try to sock it away until they reach a certain point. Let's get started. And so we have no minimums. We open funds for people whenever it makes sense for them, and just try to give them a taste of what that is like to be philanthropic. Because again, to my point, I know that once they dip their toe in it, that they will continue on that path. And so it's a conversation that I want to make sure that people are never feeling embarrassed or do I have enough money? I mean, this is community foundations. You don't need to be Warren Buffett to be a philanthropist. A philanthropist, technically, the definition is time, talent, or treasure. And we try to work around all three. We make use of a lot of people's time and talents on many of our foundation boards, and we rely on a lot of volunteer expertise to make the foundation successful. And then treasure is a different amount to everybody. And so we just make sure that they feel good about what they're doing, and we encourage anybody at any level.
That's wonderful. And can you give us contact information, like website, social media, things like that, where people can learn more?
Sure. I would just suggest going to the Mankato Area Foundation.com. You Google us, you'll find all the information, but the website's probably the most informational as far as, and it has all of our contact information on there. It has my entire team and what we do. It has my information. And so that's where I would start.
Perfect.
Because it's just... you can kind of, we've tried to clean it up. It's not as big as it used to be, but it will give you more information than you even need.
Perfect. And this is another question that I meant to ask you earlier when we were talking more about you personally, Nancy, and we asked this of all of our guests as well. And I think you kind of spoke to it. So have you experienced an aha moment in your career where you feel like everything has like really fallen into place and you were where you were meant to be?
Yes, I think I don't know if it was a one specific moment. I remember my first donation that somebody gave us $1 million, and I took a picture of the check, and I thought, "Wow, look what we can do with this! Look what we can do." But just for context, when we started, or when I started, and again. I was one of the first paid staff, so it had been volunteer run up almost until 2009. And we were a little over $2 million. We were granting about $50,000 a year. And we spent a large amount of our early time getting the infrastructure of our organization together, the right boards, the right committees, the right policies and procedures, because we knew if we were going to ask people to trust us with their charitable dollars, that we needed to have our act together. So we did that, and I remember early on, I had a board chair, And he said, Nancy, we can't think like a $2 million organization. We have to think like a $20 million organization. And I remember thinking, 20 million, are you kidding? I'll be long gone before we hit 20 million. And we in the back of our head said, if we could be 20 million by 2020. And again, it was just always kind of this. It sounded good, but we didn't know if we could do it. Anyway, we were 20 million in 2019. And we are now over 30 million. And what that means for the community is that instead of granting $50,000 a year, last year we granted about $2.3 million a year. And that's real money.
Yeah.
And so probably when we hit that 20 million mark, because it had seemed like such a pie in the sky goal at the time, that was an aha moment, because we knew at 20 million, we would be granting about $1 million into the community. And so again, now we've increased over that significantly. And so, yeah, that would probably be my biggest aha moment.
That's a great story. So what's next?
We are going to continue to grow the foundation and provide a resource. Again, I've talked about how many people have chosen to leave a legacy with this organization for the future of Mankato. And we want to make sure that the organization is properly structured and has thought about all the various aspects of philanthropy that we can. We have what we call on the checkbook, things that we just, we write grants for. And then the foundation does a lot of things that I call off the checkbook. We convene groups, we listen, we provide consultants for nonprofits that are struggling. We connect nonprofits to other nonprofits that maybe have similar needs and can work together and collaborate. There's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes that is not just writing grants. And so to do that and have those deep roots in the community, it means that I've got to have an incredibly educated, smart, savvy, visionary team working for me, which I do. And so it's just going to be growing that team, making sure that we have our finger on the pulse of this community. So as nonprofits need us, we are prepared, but as donors also want to make use of the foundation, we are in a good position to be able to help them as well.
It sounds like a very bright future. It's been so great talking to you and learning more about what the foundation does and your own story, Nancy. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Is there anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I just appreciate this opportunity anytime that I could talk about the Mankato Area Foundation. One story, when I started, I used to get phone calls saying, how much does it cost to put in a foundation? Meaning they thought that we built foundations.
Sure.
And so the fact that we have gone from a little basement office with a part-time staff and people not really understanding what a community foundation has, to the point that we are today, where I really believe that we're making a difference in the community, it just feels so good. And I just want to thank the community for embracing our work, and I enjoy what I'm doing every day.
And thank you to you and your team, and for being such great stewards of those donor dollars as well.
We enjoy it.
Thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the Build Blue podcast. We'll be back next week.